Christmas morning, I woke up smiling and found an envelope resting quietly outside my bedroom door, and my heart leapt. I truly believed my husband had left me a gift. As I opened it, my hands began to shake, because in seconds the warmth of my home turned cold beneath my feet. What I was holding wasn't a present at all. It was the moment I realized I was being pushed out of my own life. I am 55 years old, and for decades I believed I had built a steady, respectful life inside the same walls. My husband, Robert, and I shared this home through years of work, routine, and quiet understanding. It wasn't a mansion or a showpiece, but it was ours, every corner carrying memories of effort, compromise, and hope. I had always taken pride in keeping our life balanced, predictable, and calm, especially as we grew older and learned to value peace over noise. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. I loved the order of it, the familiar decorations, the gentle lights in the living room, the smell of coffee early in the morning, and the comfort of knowing where everything belonged. That year felt especially meaningful because our son Ryan and his wife Megan were coming to spend the holidays with us. I had counted the days. I planned meals carefully, wrapped small thoughtful gifts, and imagined the house filled with conversation again. In my heart, I believed Christmas would bring us closer. I told myself that time together would soften the distance I had quietly felt growing over the years. I hoped for shared laughter, calm evenings, and the simple joy of being a mother again, even if only for a few days. I didn't want anything grand, just presence, warmth, and respect. Robert seemed quieter than usual, but I brushed it aside. I told myself everyone carried stress differently. I trusted him. I trusted the life we had built together. I trusted the routines that had never failed me before. That trust made the house feel safe, solid, permanent. That morning as I walked down the hallway in my robe, I felt content. I believed I was standing inside a future that was settled and secure. I had no idea that everything I thought was stable was already being questioned, rewritten, and quietly taken away from me, starting with a single envelope waiting outside my door. I picked up the envelope slowly, still half smiling, convinced there had been some sweet misunderstanding. The paper felt heavier than it should have, thick and formal, not festive at all. My name was printed cleanly across the front. No handwriting, no familiar curve of Robert's pen. For a moment I stood there listening to the quiet house, the hum of the heater, the distant sound of traffic, trying to hold on to the warmth I had woken up with. I opened it at the kitchen counter. The words didn't make sense at first. Legal language never does when it arrives without warning. I read the first line, then the second, then the heading again. Notice. Court. Vacate. Each word landed separately like drops of ice water. My hands began to shake and I had to sit down. It was an eviction notice, paired with a formal separation filing. The document stated that I was required to leave the property by a specific date. My eyes went straight to the bottom of the page, desperate for proof that this was a mistake. That's where I saw Robert's signature. Intentional. Undeniable. I remember feeling the room tilt. The kitchen I had cleaned the night before suddenly felt unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else. I pressed my palm against the counter, trying to steady myself, trying to breathe. I kept asking the same question in my head. How could this be real? I reread the papers again and again, searching for an explanation hidden between the lines. There was none. No warning. No conversation. No attempt to speak to me before involving the court. Just cold instructions telling me to pack up a life I had spent decades building. The worst part wasn't the legal threat. It was the betrayal behind it. The idea that my husband had chosen paperwork over honesty, silence over discussion. I felt exposed, humiliated, and profoundly alone. The safety I believed in cracked instantly. I folded the papers carefully as if handling something fragile, even though it had already shattered me. In that moment, I understood that Christmas was no longer a season of comfort. It had become the day my home stopped recognizing me. I sat there until the coffee grew cold, staring at the door I had just walked through minutes earlier, wondering how quickly belonging could be erased. Every sound felt too loud, every silence too sharp. I knew even then that nothing would return to the way it was. Whatever waited ahead, I would have to face it without the comfort I had trusted for so long. That realization settled heavily, marking the true beginning of my fight to survive alone today. I carried the papers into the living room as if they might disappear if I stopped looking at them. I sat on the couch where I had spent countless evenings beside Robert, reading or watching television, and read every line again. My mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. I kept telling myself there had to be a mistake, a clerical error, something that would make this all make sense. I tried to remember the last real argument we had. There hadn't been one. There had been tension, yes, and distance, but nothing that explained this sudden cruelty. I replayed recent conversations in my head, searching for hidden warnings. Every memory came back ordinary, almost boring. That made the shock worse. This hadn't grown out of chaos. It had arrived quietly without mercy. My thoughts began to scatter. Questions piled on top of each other until I could barely focus on one. How long had he been planning this? Who helped him? Why didn't he talk to me? I felt foolish for trusting the silence, for believing calm meant safety. With every question my chest tightened and the room felt smaller. I stood up, then sat down again, unable to settle. My hands trembled so badly I had to clasp them together. I walked from room to room, touching familiar objects as if I needed proof that my life had actually existed. Family photos. Holiday decorations. Furniture we had chosen together. Everything looked the same, yet none of it felt like mine anymore. That was when the fear fully set in. Not just fear of losing my home, but fear of losing my place in the world. I realized how much of my identity was tied to being a wife, a mother, a caretaker. If those roles were being stripped away without warning, what was left of me? I felt myself breaking from the inside. Tears came suddenly, sharp and uncontrollable. I sank onto the floor, back against the couch, clutching the papers like evidence of a crime I didn't understand. I had spent my life holding things together, being reasonable, patient, steady. Now for the first time I felt truly helpless. The worst part was the silence. No explanation. No voice. Just my own breathing and the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. In that quiet, disbelief turned into something heavier. I knew confusion alone wouldn't protect me. Whatever this was, it was real and it was already pulling me apart. I heard the car before I saw it, the familiar sound of tires on the driveway pulling me out of my thoughts. For a brief second, something hopeful stirred in me. My son was here. Whatever this nightmare was, surely Ryan would stand by me. I wiped my face quickly, folded the papers, and tried to look composed as the front door opened. Ryan walked in first, followed closely by Megan. They looked comfortable, settled, as if nothing were wrong. Megan smiled politely, the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. Ryan barely looked at me before setting his bag down. I waited for a question, for concern, for any sign that they had noticed something was wrong. None came. I finally spoke, my voice quieter than I expected. I told them about the envelope. I watched Ryan's face carefully, hoping to see surprise or anger on my behalf. Instead, his expression hardened. He sighed like someone exhausted by a long-standing problem. That reaction cut deeper than any shout could have. He told me I had pushed his father too far. He said I was controlling, difficult, and always creating tension. His words felt rehearsed, as if he had practiced them before walking through the door. Megan stood beside him, silent, her arms folded loosely, watching me with calm interest. She didn't defend me. She didn't interrupt. Her silence felt deliberate. Ryan suggested I leave the house for a while, just until things settled down. He said it would be better for everyone. Better for whom, he didn't say. I realized then that he wasn't shocked by the papers. He was prepared for them. That understanding hit me slowly, painfully. I looked at Megan, searching for empathy, but her face remained smooth and unreadable. There was no warmth there, no hesitation. She avoided my eyes, as if distancing herself made this easier. In that moment, I understood that whatever story had been told about me, she had accepted it completely. Standing there, in my own living room, I felt smaller than I ever had before. The two people I had been waiting for, the ones I believed would bring comfort, were now standing firmly on the other side. I wasn't just facing my husband's decision anymore. I was facing my son's choice to turn away from me. That realization settled heavily in my chest. This wasn't confusion anymore. It was alignment. They had arrived knowing exactly where they stood, and it wasn't with me. I found Robert in the bedroom, standing near the closet, avoiding my eyes as if he already knew what I was about to say. I held the papers out in front of me, my hands still unsteady, and asked him to explain. My voice didn't sound angry. It sounded tired. That hurt more than if I had screamed. He took a deep breath before answering, as though he had been preparing for this moment. He told me he was exhausted. He said I had become controlling, that I questioned his decisions, that I made him feel trapped in his own home. Each accusation landed like a quiet blow. I listened carefully, trying to recognize the woman he was describing. I couldn't find her. I reminded him of our life together. The years we spent building this home, supporting our son, sharing responsibilities. I asked him why he hadn't talked to me first. Why he chose a court notice instead of a conversation. He shook his head and said talking never worked, that I always needed things my way. His words felt borrowed, polished by repetition. As he spoke, something became clear to me. This wasn't just his frustration. There was a script beneath it. Phrases that didn't sound like him. Complaints he had never voiced before, now delivered with certainty. I realized he had been listening to someone else for a long time, absorbing their version of me until it replaced his own. I asked him directly if Ryan and Megan had influenced this decision. He hesitated just long enough to answer the question for me. He admitted they had concerns, that they worried about his happiness, that they believed distance from me might help. Hearing my own son used as justification felt unbearable. Robert told me he didn't want conflict. He said the papers were the easiest solution. That sentence shattered something inside me. After decades of partnership, I had been reduced to a problem to be solved quickly and quietly. No discussion. No respect. I felt anger rise then, sharp and focused. Not just at him but at myself for accepting so much silence for so long. I told him I wasn't leaving without understanding my rights. His face shifted, surprise then discomfort. For the first time I saw uncertainty replace confidence. As I walked out of the room I understood something important. Robert wasn't powerful. He was afraid. And fear, when mixed with pressure, had made him choose betrayal over honesty. That realization didn't ease the pain, but it hardened my resolve. Whatever happened next, I would not disappear quietly. I packed a small bag without really thinking about what I was doing. A few clothes, my toiletries, my phone charger. Items chosen out of habit rather than intention. My hands moved automatically, while my mind stayed frozen on the words Robert had spoken. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. That silence felt deliberate, like permission had already been granted for my absence. As I walked down the hallway I paused briefly, taking in the familiar space one last time. The framed photos, the decorations I had put up just days earlier, the quiet order I had always maintained, it all looked unchanged. Yet I felt like a visitor already, someone leaving a place that no longer claimed them. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face, sharp and grounding. That was when I saw it. The trunk of Ryan's car was open and boxes were being carried inside. Megan stood nearby, directing where things should go, her movements confident and assured. It was as if the house had already been reassigned, my presence erased before I had even crossed the threshold. I stood there, unseen, watching as my son helped carry their belongings into the home I was being told to leave. No one looked my way. No one hesitated. In that moment the truth settled in with painful clarity. This wasn't a reaction. It was a plan. Every step had been considered, every role assigned. I had simply been the last to find out. The realization burned quietly. I wasn't being asked to step aside temporarily. I was being replaced. The timing, the paperwork, the calm confidence. It all pointed to a future that no longer included me. I felt foolish for not seeing it sooner, for mistaking politeness for loyalty and silence for peace. I closed the car door behind me and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. My chest felt tight but my thoughts were suddenly sharp. Betrayal has a way of stripping things down to their core. In losing my place I had gained something unexpected. Clarity. Whatever they believed I would do, cry, retreat, accept, I knew one thing for certain. I would not vanish quietly from my own life. I didn't go far. I parked a few streets away, turned off the engine and sat there in silence. My hands were still on the steering wheel, but my thoughts had finally slowed enough for something practical to surface. If they were using paperwork to erase me, then paperwork was where I needed to look. I wasn't ready to give up without understanding the truth. I drove back and waited until the house was quiet again. When I went inside, no one questioned me. I went straight to the small filing cabinet in the study, the one I had organized years ago and maintained ever since. Inside were folders labeled with dates, taxes, insurance and property records. Familiar, orderly, untouched. For the first time that day something felt steady. I pulled out the property documents and spread them across the desk. Deeds. Purchase records. Mortgage statements. I read carefully, line by line, forcing myself to stay calm. The language was dry and technical, but it was honest. The truth didn't hide itself for long. The house was jointly owned. My name was there clearly and legally alongside Robert's. Not as an afterthought. Not as a dependent. As an equal. I felt a slow, steady shift inside my chest. The panic I had been carrying all morning began to loosen its grip. The eviction notice suddenly looked less powerful, less final. I realized that Robert couldn't force me out on his own. Not legally. Not quietly. Whatever promises had been made, they weren't grounded in reality. I leaned back in the chair and let myself breathe. For the first time since opening that envelope, I felt something other than fear. I felt resolve. This wasn't just about a marriage unraveling. It was about rights, about years of contribution, about being recognized as more than an inconvenience to be removed. I gathered the papers neatly and returned them to the folder. My hands were steadier now. I wasn't imagining outcomes anymore. I was thinking in steps. Questions formed clearly in my mind, followed by decisions. I knew I needed professional guidance. I knew I needed to protect myself. As I closed the cabinet, I understood that this was my turning point. I had walked into the day believing I was powerless. I was ending it knowing that I wasn't. The law at least still saw me. And that knowledge changed everything. I made the appointment that same afternoon. My voice was calm when I spoke to the receptionist, even though my hands were still trembling. Saying the words out loud, separation, eviction notice, joint property, made everything feel more real, but it also made it actionable. I wasn't spiraling anymore. I was moving. Rebecca's office was quiet and professional, the kind of place where emotions are acknowledged but facts lead the conversation. She greeted me with steady eye contact and invited me to sit. I placed the papers on her desk and told my story from the beginning, careful not to exaggerate, careful not to minimize. I needed the truth to stand on its own. She listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes, occasionally asking for clarification. When I finished, she reviewed the documents methodically. I watched her face, searching for concern or hesitation. Instead, she nodded. That simple gesture felt like oxygen. Rebecca explained the situation clearly. The house was jointly owned. An eviction could not be enforced by one spouse against the other. Any separation required due process, and even then my rights were protected. As for Ryan and Megan, she was direct. They had no legal standing to remain in the home without my consent. Hearing that out loud was grounding. It cut through the emotional fog with precision. He asked me what I wanted. The question caught me off guard. For so long I had been reacting, accommodating, absorbing pressure. I took a moment before answering. I told her I wanted fairness. I wanted my space respected. I wanted to stop being pushed into decisions I didn't agree with. Rebecca outlined the next steps: formal responses, documentation, notices if necessary. She didn't promise revenge or drama. She promised protection and clarity. That mattered more. She reminded me that standing up for myself didn't make me aggressive. It made me responsible. As I left her office, something had shifted. I wasn't suddenly fearless, but I was no longer lost. The weight I had been carrying since morning had redistributed itself into something manageable. I understood that strength doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly through information and resolve. Sitting in my car afterward, I felt taller somehow. The same world was around me, but I was moving through it differently. I had walked in believing I was being erased. I walked out knowing I was still visible, still entitled, still capable of deciding what came next. That realization didn't just steady me, it gave me back myself. The legal process moved faster than I expected. Rebecca filed the response immediately, outlining my ownership rights and challenging the eviction notice in clear, firm language. Seeing my name defended on official documents felt surreal. For the first time since Christmas morning, the narrative wasn't being written about me without me. I was part of it, present, protected, and heard. When Robert received the legal response, his demeanor changed. The confidence he had shown earlier faded into visible discomfort. He avoided direct conversations and kept his distance, as if hoping the situation might resolve itself without confrontation. But the law doesn't respond to avoidance. Pressure builds when facts are introduced, and that pressure has a way of pulling the truth to the surface. Ryan called me that evening. His tone was sharper than usual, impatient. He asked why I was making things complicated. I told him calmly that I was simply protecting what was mine. There was a pause on the line, followed by defensiveness. He accused me of trying to punish them. I corrected him. This wasn't punishment. It was reality. As the case progressed, formal questions were raised. Timelines mattered. Intentions mattered. Robert was asked to explain why the eviction notice had been filed without proper authority. Under scrutiny, his explanations weakened. The language he had used so confidently at home fell apart in a legal setting. Eventually, the truth came out. Robert admitted that the decision hadn't originated with him. He confessed that Ryan and Megan had pressured him relentlessly, framing my presence as a problem and promising peace if I was removed. Hearing that confirmation hurt, but it also brought clarity. I wasn't imagining things. I hadn't misunderstood. This had been planned. The acknowledgement changed the dynamic entirely. What had felt like a personal failure was revealed as manipulation. The story shifted from blame to responsibility. Rebecca documented everything carefully, ensuring that the record reflected what had actually happened, not what had been implied behind closed doors. When the formal notice was issued requiring Ryan and Megan to vacate the property, the house felt different. Quieter. Heavier. The power imbalance had corrected itself. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't relieved in the way I thought I might be. I was simply steady. The truth doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it emerges under pressure, stripped of emotion, undeniable. And once it does, there's no going back to pretending. That day I understood something important. Standing still had never protected me. Standing up had. And that truth, once spoken, could not be taken back. Robert apologized a few days later. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a heaviness that suggested he finally understood the damage he had caused. He said he was sorry for letting things go this far, for listening to pressure instead of speaking to me, for choosing the easiest path instead of the honest one. I listened without interrupting. His words mattered, but they arrived too late to undo what had already been broken. He asked for forgiveness. I didn't give it. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because forgiveness requires safety and safety requires change. I told him that apologies without boundaries would only repeat the same harm. That was my final decision. I wasn't leaving, and I wasn't pretending this was just a misunderstanding we could brush aside. I explained my boundaries calmly and clearly. This house was my home, and no decisions about it would ever be made without me again. Ryan and Megan would not return. Not temporarily. Not later. I needed space, respect, and time to rebuild trust. If that was even possible. These weren't demands. They were conditions for my peace. Robert struggled to accept that I wouldn't return to the version of our marriage that existed before. He wanted normalcy, familiarity, comfort. I wanted accountability. I told him that control disguised as silence had no place in my life anymore. If we were going to share a roof, it would be with honesty and distance, not denial. Setting those boundaries felt frightening but also grounding. For the first time, I wasn't negotiating my worth or explaining my right to exist in my own space. I was stating it. Firmly. When the conversation ended, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. I hadn't won anything. I had simply stopped losing myself. That decision, quiet, deliberate, and final, became the line I refused to cross backward. Whatever came next would be built on clarity, not fear. And that, finally, was something I could live with. Life inside the house settled into a different rhythm after that. Quieter, more deliberate. Robert and I continued living under the same roof. But the space between us was no longer filled with unspoken expectations or silent compromises. We moved around each other carefully, like two people relearning the shape of a familiar place that had changed. I focused on myself in ways I hadn't for years. Simple things at first. My morning routine, my meals, the way I spent my afternoons. I stopped checking my choices against someone else's comfort. I didn't ask permission to exist anymore. That alone felt like reclaiming a part of myself I had slowly given away. The house began to feel like mine again, not because anyone said it was, but because I allowed myself to belong in it. I rearranged small things, opened windows, let light in where it had been blocked. Each quiet action carried meaning. I wasn't erasing the past. I was redefining the present. Robert tried in his own way to be considerate. But I no longer depended on his approval to feel stable. Our interactions were polite, distant, and honest. There was no pretending that everything was fine. There didn't need to be. Peace didn't require illusion, it required boundaries. What surprised me most was the calm. Not happiness exactly, but steadiness. I slept better. I breathed deeper. I trusted my instincts again. The fear that had once ruled my decisions lost its hold as self-respect took its place. I realized then that dignity isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It simply stands firm and refuses to be moved. I hadn't rebuilt my life from scratch. I had reclaimed it. And that quiet victory mattered more than any apology ever could. Looking back now, I understand how easily a life can be rewritten by the people closest to you. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes wrapped in paperwork, silence, and the quiet confidence of those who believe you will simply step aside. I was expected to disappear politely to make room to accept the story written for me. I didn't. What I learned through this experience is something I wish I had understood earlier. Love without respect is not safety, and peace built on silence is fragile. I spent years believing that keeping things calm meant keeping them healthy. I was wrong. Calm without honesty is just delay. And delay eventually becomes loss. Standing up for myself didn't make me cruel or unkind. It made me visible. It reminded me that age does not weaken a woman's right to dignity, and that being a mother or a wife does not require surrendering your voice. I didn't fight to punish anyone. I fought to remain whole. I still live in the same house, but I live in it differently now. With awareness. With boundaries. With self-respect that no one else gets to negotiate. The pain didn't vanish, but it no longer defines me. It taught me where my strength truly lives. If there is one truth I carry forward, it is this. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is refuse to leave the life she built, especially when others decide she no longer belongs. I stayed. And in staying, I finally chose myself. If my story resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the journeys of other voices that refuse to disappear quietly. I'd really like to know, what would you have done if you were standing in my place that Christmas morning? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have stood your ground? Share your thoughts with me in the comments. I read every one of them.